I think it's fitting that, did anybody see the full moon on the way in? So full moon, Halloween's in not even a week, right? So the mood is right for true crime. And when we get rolling, I'm going to ask Jim to hit the lights so we can pay attention to the screen. I do have an authentic jug that I inherited. I don't know how many generations old it is, but it does play into the story. I just wish I had somebody who knew something about spirits and alcohol, maybe had been a brewmaster his career, that could comment on. Has anybody in the audience been a brewmaster before? No? No? I think we got...
There's probably some good stuff in there.
I think we have an alumnus of the Anheuser-Busch Brewery in the audience, but we'll keep it confidential for now. I want to thank the friends and family that have shown up, because they're all on the groom's side, most of them, not on the bride's side. But without them, we'd have a crowd of maybe 7 or 8. So that's great. And I do want to thank the ladies up in the gallery. They're here for every presentation, so it's nice to have them too. And gentlemen, sorry about that. So yeah, this is a true crime. I've kind of gotten passionate about true crime, not the sensational or gory or grisly, but really some mysteries from the past 200 to 150 years, and trying to piece, like Barb, trying to piece together what happened through newspaper articles and things like that. And it really is fascinating to find out what happened. And you got to remember, this was long before the internet, and there were no forensic skills, there was no DNA testing. So a lot of these things just remain mysterious for long periods of time. So we'll just hop right into it. This is called The Disappearance in Dead Creek. And you know, 50 years ago, Tony Christopher was Van Buren's first town historian. And he rightly labeled the area the Valley of Intrigue. But some folks took it a bit further, and if you Google Dead Creek and Whiskey Hollow, you'll find an article describing a full-length horror movie filmed there by local teams back in 2012. One of the teens is quoted as saying that, quote, "There are local legends about Whiskey Hollow and stories of Satanist rituals taking place in the woods." Does anybody know where Whiskey Hollow and Dead Creek are? Right, okay. I think for my group of friends, I know we've been up there once or twice. I'm not sure what we were doing. The article goes on to state that although none of the legends can be proven, the road is featured on several websites and in books about haunted places. And let me be clear, there were no satanic rituals that I know of. The place is not haunted, as I know. But as a local historian myself, I wonder why folks make this stuff up. Because if you just did a little bit of research, you can discover that what really happened there over a century ago is probably just as titillating and mysterious. We're going to hit the lights, right? Okay, cool. So that's kind of what I did. So that's what this story is about. We're going to try to unravel what happened in Dead Creek back in 1908 and a little bit after. You know, some guys bowl, some guys golf, some guys fish. I do local history. It's a little unusual, but it's how I spend my time. I've investigated 16 mysterious deaths and murders between 1840 and 1920, all of them located in or around this area. In the red, there's the town of Lysander. You can see Phoenix just off to the northeast. This is the third of these cases that I've actually put together, developed, and presented. They've all been researched fully and are ready to go, but putting them together in a presentation can be challenging. The other two were, one was called the Dam Murder, or that Dam Murder in Phoenix. I don't know if anybody remembers that one. We did it here. And the Baldwinsville Homicide just down the road from Dead Creek. And I'm going to try to point those out. That Dam Murder is right there in Phoenix, 1911. The Baldwinsville Homicide was right here in 1873. And I actually Sue and Barb and Gail, excuse me, I think that's the Boley murder in 1908 that you guys presented. So we have so much more to do up there. You can see all the different stories we could create. You know, well, this case is certainly mysterious. I have to say up front, we don't know for sure whether it's a death, let alone a murder, but we'll try to find that out as we go along. When I do these presentations, regardless of whether they involve murder or not, I try to answer just 3 questions. They're not always the 3 same questions, but I try to boil it down to 3 things just to make it manageable. The first question tonight is, who disappeared at Dead Creek? And in answering these questions, I've tried to rely as much as possible on actual newspaper stories from the time, and I quote from them when appropriate. So throughout the presentation, when I speak, it's not going to sound like Steve talk. It's going to sound like a newspaper article from 150 years ago. So just bear that in mind. A lot of this is quoted right out of newspaper articles. So it's very fact-based. For those of you who may not know where Dead Creek is, a lot of you raised your hands. It drains Whiskey Hollow and Satan's Kingdom into the Seneca River. And yes, Satan's Kingdom is actually a place. It's kind of now referred to as just the kingdom. There's Dead Creek. Beeville's over here. If you go out Route 31, there's the creek. And Route 31 comes along here and heads off to Jordan. And Whiskey Hollow is a valley that feeds it. Satan's Kingdom is up on this plateau here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about why it's called that. It's a densely wooded plateau bounded by Dead Creek on the east and the Seneca River on the north and west. It's isolated somewhat from the surrounding countryside just because of its limited access and height. While they were still young reporters working at the Syracuse Post-Standard, Elizabeth Pike, you'll see her down there in the bottom right, collaborated with Elmer Bogardus to write a series called The Forgotten Villages of Onondaga County, which he turned into a book. She said that Satan's Kingdom once was eminently distinguished for the belligerent, litigious, and pugnacious character of its inhabitants. So kind of a remarkable place. And it took its very appropriate name from a man who was continually at variance with his neighbors. After a long course of law proceedings with another neighbor, one declared he'd be king of the country. The other retorted that he was more fit for a king to reign over that place than Satan himself. The settlement henceforth was known as Satan's Kingdom, not because of any satanic rituals, just because of what it was called. It's known today by locals simply as the Kingdom, as I said. Clearly it was never a village, but today it's still kind of known as the Kingdom. And obviously there's a Kingdom Road up there too. Who knows where the Kingdom is? Anybody been up there? Yeah, if you go to Whiskey Hollow, it's very close. I try to go back and I try to find contemporaneous photos as well of these places, so you can get a feel for what these places looked like 100 years ago or more. Here we see two views of Dead Creek from about 100 years ago. As you can see, it's always been a swampy, desolate place, made even more so by the building of the barge canal around the time of this case. This case is in 1908. You may not know, but the barge canal came through Beeville and Lock 24 in 1910. That was when the Erie Canal that ran south through places like Jordan and Weedsport and Camillus bypassed Baldwinsville, and they got rid of Clinton's Ditch and filled it in, and they created a new barge canal using the river system and the lake system. Its source is a place called White Bottom Creek, which starts south of the Erie Canal in the town of Elbridge. Dead Creek is fed also by many steep streams that drain the hills to the east and to the west, including one at Whiskey Hollow. Now, here we see two views of Whiskey Hollow circa 1900. These are actual photos. According to the Syracuse Herald in 1899, there aren't many villages like Whiskey Hollow, valleys like Whiskey Hollow. A large and notable spring pours out a great volume of pure and elegant water on the north hillside of the valley. I don't know if anybody's been up there to see the spring. It's good water. Watch the E. coli, that's all I can say. And it rushes down from the hillside to the trout brook of Dead Creek lower down in the valley. Whiskey Hollow for years has been known as a romantic valley where shingles were made by the thousands and where impecunious, poor residents were accustomed to jollify and become merry on the corn whiskey. And we have a jug right here. If anybody wants to try that whiskey, you can check it out later. History says that in this part of the country, there were 11 distilleries, principally combined to the towns of Lysander and Van Buren. Think about that for a second. 11 distilleries, all were making some kind of whiskey, most likely corn. 1,000 pine shingles would buy several gallons of what they called tanglefoot intoxicant. That was their name for whiskey. And those that drank it claimed that its effects on the digestive organs were of the most pleasing character because of its purity and stimulating properties, and probably other things. So that's how Whiskey Hollow got its name. That jug has actually been in my family a long time, but neither one of my grandparents would take a drop of alcohol, so I'm not sure what use it served. Here we see two views of the Loveridge home near Whiskey Hollow in 1899. According to that same article, Whiskey Hollow's had its rudely made homes for scores of people for years. In the vicinity, there are still standing several log houses in dilapidated condition. Got to remember, this is over 100 years ago. There are only a few of these log cabins in existence in central New York today. They're as scarce as hen's teeth And in these days of fine frame dwellings, they present a striking contrast alongside modern houses. The residents were choppers, wood choppers, crosscut sawyers, shingle makers, and berry pickers. So kind of eking out a living on the land and the like in early days. So kind of hopefully you have a better sense for the place and its people some 100 years ago. Again, these are actual photographs of the people that lived there and the lives that they led and how they lived. Now we kind of get into the story of the disappearance and what happened. These are not actual photos from the case, but they're photos or illustrations I dug up, and I thought they kind of gave you an idea of what happened. It was in the midst of berry picking season on June 28, 1908, according to one local paper that, quote, a mysterious stranger was seen several times in the vicinity of the swamp who was well supplied with money. According to another paper, who he was, no one ever learned. What he was doing there, he would not tell. And his spick and span city dress and manner and abundance of money in an out-of-the-way section of the county aroused their curiosity. I just showed you some pictures of who these people were, how they lived, what they looked like. If somebody comes along and they're citified and they're well-resourced, they stuck out like a sore thumb. He was last seen at the David Murray place on Easthead Creek Road shortly before noon. The stranger had his Sunday dinner with the Murrays and offered to pay with a $2 bill. And, you know, it doesn't sound like much today, but $2 would be worth $69 today. A lot of money to carry around back then. Afterwards, he walked slowly to the north a few rods, about 30 to 50 feet, and stood as if rolling a cigarette. After that, he just dropped from sight. And literally, that was the last that anyone saw of this mysterious stranger. Now, you could say, well, okay, well, he moved on, right? No big deal. He had lunch, dinner, whatever, and moseyed on out of there. But later that summer, in a harbinger of things to come, two of these women were obliged to change their places while picking berries in the swamp because of an unbearable stench. I think we know what that could mean. They were later unable to locate the spot due to the thickness of the brush. Now, in early December, some 6 months later, Herman Maltby and Lewis Rouse found a battered, weather-beaten suitcase while lumbering in the swamp on Maltby's farm. There's two of them right there. Of three, you can see they're hewing a log right there near Dead Creek 120 years ago. Snow prevented a close search of the ground surrounding the place where the articles were found. It's a dismal place some distance from the highway and seldom visited. In the suitcase were found a laundered shirt, a shaving cup, a brush, and a few articles of clothing. There was also an iron rod such as used for cleaning revolvers. A coat found near the suitcase was folded as though used for a pillow. The coat was found on a small knoll and the suitcase but a short distance away. The coat contained a letter, which was key to the identity of the owner. Besides the letter, it contained several revolver cartridges which fell from the pockets into the snow where the coat was found. So the letter that was found inside was addressed to James F. Lawler of Glens Falls by his brother, informing him of his mother's death. Later that week, the lumbermen returned to the site with their wives, Irene Maltby and Margaret Rouse. While the husbands were shoveling, the wives a few feet away came upon a little heap of torn pieces of paper, which indicated by the writing upon them that they had the property of the missing man. The pieces of paper were caked up with snow, dirt, sticks, and ice, and when thawed out and put together, made parts of what evidently once had been a daily diary, kept on loose sheets of tablet paper. The writing told of how he'd spent his time at work with his horses, and the records told of the details of each horse's condition and work, as only a lover of horses would transcribe it. Other pieces of paper makes a 3-page letter, evidently written to Lawler by his brother Tom. It's just a common letter, kind of from one brother to another, and tells of nothing of importance to the case so far as it is legible. Beside the papers was a piece of iron fashioned like a cold chisel, with the sharp end bent and split in the middle like a nail puller. Its connection with the case mystified the farmers. And 2 more .36 caliber cartridges were found near the place where Lawler's suitcase was located. This makes 5 bullets now discovered, but James F. Lawler was nowhere to be found. So this was pretty big news, as you can imagine, in December of 1908. I found, just in cursory searching, 25 articles about the case in newspapers from Albany to Buffalo, certainly locally, but also even as far away as New York City. It was big news. At the time, Andrew Helms was chief of police in Beeville. At one point, he and a party of 8 to 10 farmers made a search of Dead Creek Swamp in an effort to discover the body of Lawler. Throughout December, Chief Helms and Lawler's father searched for him, his whole family actually, his brother too, constantly debating in the press about whether James Lawler was still alive or dead. If he was alive, then where was he now? If he was dead, then where was the body? And if he was dead, then how did he die? Was it murder, suicide, or accident? So you can see each day, each week in all these different papers, editors are speculating about what happened to this guy, where did he go, if he was done in, who did him in, why. It just was a complete mystery to the local public and throughout the state. You know, Chief Helms entertained little doubt, there's Chief Helms with his wife Minnie on the left, that the bones of the missing man lie somewhere in the vicinity. He believed that Lawler was dead, that his body would be found in the swamp, and that the case was one of murder or suicide. One theory is put forth that Lawler met his death after a fight in which he dropped his valise or suitcase and thrown off his coat. Then it's also thought that he may have left the suitcase and coat at the place where it was found and walked deeper into the swamp to take his own life. Chief Helms also said that near Dead Creek in the swamp, and this is news to me, if anybody's familiar with the area, were quicksands where a man could easily disappear and in all probability never been found. Now, I've done a lot of research on the town of Van Buren, Dead Creek. I've never heard about quicksand out there. A cow was said to have recently sunk in one of these places, so either that it got better or they never were there. So although baffled and mystified by what he learned at Beeville, John Lawler declared, the father declared that he does not believe the body of his son James, the missing horseman, will be found in Dead Creek Swamp, although the description of the stranger that had dinner at the David Murray home on June 28th tallied in nearly every particular with that of his son, and the effects in the suitcase found there were undoubtedly those of the missing man. Still, Mr. Lawler is of the opinion that his son is still alive. Eventually, Chief Helms gave up the search. So did Lawler's family. They went back to Glens Falls with no solution to the mystery. So there you have it. Kind of cases dropped. Local police have given up. Families kind of given up. Where is he? What happened to him? Really, there's nothing more to be done. If you do a little more digging, I think things get a little more interesting. They may not have had that opportunity. According to his brother, Lawler was 36 years old, unmarried, and had no enemies. He was not the sort of man to make enemies. His brother said that he'd followed the horses since he was a boy. In June of 1908, he followed the Grand Circuit races to the New York State Fairgrounds. There's the program. He was at that race. That's what it looked like in the day. They were doing harness racing back then. He was caring for his employer's horses, and the men who cared for the horses slept in the quarters at the stables on the fairgrounds. And on the morning of June 27th, again, this is the day before he was last seen near Dead Creek, Lawler could not be found when the horsemen, the others, saw no more of him and did not know where he went. He left nearly all of his clothing in his quarters and left undrawn his pay for the month of June. Lawler appeared sad and melancholy and spoke to a few of his companions when greeted. One horseman who knew Lawler said there was something wrong with Jim. He said that he must be crazy because he left the outfit 2 days before before payday and had not been seen since. He added that Jim was always a saving fellow, and Lawler's brother believed he'd saved money, but how much he would not venture to say. So net, you got this guy, loves horses, been training horses a long time, always went to the state fair to work for his employer, training and racing horses, had a bit of money, saved a bit of money, and is, boop, gone. So one of the most startling facts conveyed by Lawler's father to the authorities who have charged the case was that shortly before his son came to Syracuse, from Glens Falls area, he drew from a bank between $1,100 and $1,300. That such a sum of money was motive sufficient for murder and robbery, the authorities believe, but they have yet to locate Lawler or his lifeless body and find whether or the money is with him, whether or not. According to his father, he always carried $400 or $500 with him, and the father learned that he drew between $1,100 and $1,300 from a bank before he left. You can see the newspapers exaggerated a little bit, but clearly there was evidence that he took some money out. It said the missing man has another $1,000 remaining in another bank, So he'd saved a lot. And this fact now leads authorities to believe that it was by murder that Lawler met his end. Regardless of whether Lawler last had $1,100 or $1,300 on him, it was still agreed that it was a great deal of money. And just so you know, that's a range of about $38,000 to $45,000 in today's dollars. Now, I don't know about you, I can't imagine carrying around the kind of money today, and I'm sure that it struck folks as just as strange back then, especially if you find out this guy's walking around in Dead Creek flashing rolls of money. Probably not a great idea. Before moving forward, let's go back and retrace Lawler's last known whereabouts on a local map from the time. This is a local map from 1900, about the time he disappeared. And I just kind of pieced together, well, what happened in his final days? Where did he go? So on the evening of Friday, June 26th, he's last seen by his co-workers when they went to sleep in the stables at the New York State Fairgrounds right there on the shore of Onondaga Lake. Second, before noon on Sunday, June 28th, some local folks encounter a stranger with a spick and span city dress and manner near Dead Creek who seems to resemble Lawler. Remember the berry pickers and the people that fed him. Later that afternoon, 3, David and Sarah Murray have dinner with the man who asked for a meal, showing a large roll of bills and offering to pay with a $2 bill, who again just seemed to resemble Lawler, number 3. And then finally, in December, this is months later, so 1, 2, and 3 happened within just days of each other. And then number 4, a little further north in the Dead Creek Valley, a suitcase, coat, and letters were found in the same spot where some women were picking berries in the summer and were forced to pick elsewhere because of an unbearable stench. So unfortunately, it seems likely that this too was Lawler, which leads to our second question, okay? So question number 2 is, who was the missing man's employer? You may say, well, what's the big deal? Why is that the second question? Aren't there other questions we can ask? Well, strangely, no connection was ever made that I can find between James Lawler's disappearance in Dead Creek and what happened shortly thereafter to his boss at the time. Now, his boss is an interesting guy. A guy named George Sherman from Mariah, New York, Essex County. Who knows where Mariah is? Crown Point, right on the shore of Lake Champlain, right on the eastern edge of the Adirondacks. Was a very wealthy area known for mining ore. So, you know, Lawler trained horses for this guy, George Sherman. In February of 1907, the year before, James Lawler left Glens Falls to work for George D. Sherman, training horses at the Sherman Stock Farm in Mariah. The tiny hamlet of Mariah is located due west of the village of Port Henry in Essex County. It's situated between the eastern edge of the Adirondack Mountains, the western shore of Lake Champlain. It's the second largest county in New York State with an area roughly the size of the state of Delaware. I've driven through it. There's nothing there. It's huge, but it's very rural. One of the Syracuse papers praised the promising horses in the Sherman stable of Mariah, reporting that one of the racing stables at the State Fair track, which has attracted unusual interest because of the number of promising horses it contains, is that of G.D. Sherman of Port Henry, proprietor of the Sherman Stock Farms. It was Sherman's horses that Lawler was stabling at the New York State Fairgrounds when he disappeared 1 year later. So clearly this guy's probably the most prominent breeder of thoroughbred racehorses in New York State. Incredibly wealthy, loves horses, and hired Lawler because Lawler at the time had a reputation as a very good trainer. Now, a little bit about Sherman. In addition to his stock farm, he owned and operated his own racetrack outside Mariah on Forge Hollow Road. The Sherman Trotting Park was incorporated in 1902 to improve the breed of horses and conduct race meetings. One local history book said the Sherman Racetrack, owned by G.D. Sherman, was for many years a popular resort for sport lovers, and several largely attended race meetings were held there. Sherman had a large string of trotters and pacers, which were trained here for the Grand Circuit races. And if you look closely at the front of the grandstand in the photo, you can see the record set by the famous racehorses, okay, who traveled the Grand Circuit at the time. The Grand Circuit was you traveled these famous racetracks with your horses, tried to set records and win money. These included superstars like Prince Alert and Dan Patch, and they're still considered by many to be the greatest harney racehorses of all time 120 years later. I discovered another interesting bit of information about Lawler's employer, this guy, George Douglas Sherman. About the same time that Lawler vanished, Sherman was building another racetrack on 12 acres of land a little closer to our home. Who knows where Messina Springs was? Okay, Colomer, East Syracuse, that area. 12 acres of land near East Syracuse and Messina Springs on the northwest corner of James Street and Thompson Road. It's right in there now, okay? No longer there, obviously. It's now the site of Syracuse Haulers and some other businesses. The top article shows a photo of the landscape, okay, around Lawler's new racetrack, Sherman's new racetrack before it was built. And the file, the one on the bottom map, you can see an outline of the racetrack when it was built. So he was moving his, enterprise from Moriah to Syracuse, expanding his horizons, primarily because he wanted to be closer to the New York State Fairgrounds, which was becoming probably the preeminent track in upstate New York. As a result, Sherman spent a great deal of time here in Syracuse. He bought a summer home in Syracuse on West Genesee Street and a farm out in Colomer called Woodlawn. I've not been able to find any record of it. I don't know if anybody knows about it. Come see me afterwards, I'd be interested. George Sherman had the time and means to raise and race horses for one very good reason. He was filthy rich. Together with a man named Witherby, Sherman's grandfather founded Witherby, Sherman and Company, which at the time owned 30,000 acres in Essex County and operated the Port Henry Iron Ore Company, one of the richest ore mines in the world. In the aptly named hamlets of Witherby and Mineville, they established the most extensive system of mines in the Adirondack Mountains. The mines were so productive that when George Sherman cast out of the business in 1900 at the age of 46, his share was worth the equivalent of over $60 million today. So he was done working, he inherited, and now he was moving on to racing horses. This $60 million, to be clear, did not include the value of any of his significant land holdings, Syracuse, Moriah, anywhere else, or the many properties he'd acquired over the next 10 years. Just his share of these iron ore companies. And you can see that's a real photo of the Witherby, Sherman, Port Henry Iron Ore Company in Mineville. He was born into wealth. George Sherman lived most of his life in the little hamlet of Moriah, not far from where these vast mines his family owned and operated. There are two views of Moriah at the time of this case. The top one is looking west. There you are. And the bottom one looking north. In the bottom photo, you can see the Sherman Institute, which he founded. On the west side of the street, Idlehurst, his home on the east side. I've actually been past it and taken a photo. At the time, Moriah was about the size of Warner's, New York, but was situated in an even more remote area. It's no surprise then that given his wealth and power, Sherman was a very big fish in a very small pond. Contemporary local newspapers of Essex County are filled with stories about him, his family, Witherby Sherman, and the Port Henry Iron Ore Company. But Sherman's opulent and extravagant lifestyle was in stark contrast to that of the miners that worked for him. So we're already setting up some dynamic tension between a mining baron who's worth 46 million, or whatever, 60 million at the age of 46, and the poor miners that worked for him at the time, making not very much money. Just to be clear, his lifestyle was in stark contrast to that of his miners. These were the early days of antitrust laws and organized labor. So the robber barons of industry, like Sherman, operated with little or no oversight from either government or unions. Mining was both unhealthy, dangerous work. It didn't pay much to compensate them for the risks they were forced to take every day. At the time of this case, miners earned about $2 a day, working 6 days a week in very, very dangerous conditions, which equates to about $20,000 per year in today's money. Doesn't sound like too bad, but think about the risks they were taking. And more important, in the places like the aptly named Mineville, mining companies like Witherby Sherman's Port Henry Iron Ore Company exerted a loose kind of paternalism over the townspeople. In other words, it meant making the local people dependent on the company. by paying inflated prices for basic needs like food, clothing, shelter. A government report at the time said that the state of housing, sanitation, and water supply in Mineville were all below acceptable levels. It also revealed the company's cover-up of accidents and worker deaths. This led to labor unrest and eventually strikes against the Port Henry Iron Ore Company and its owner, the Witherby Sherman Company, which called in the services, at the time this was done, of strike breakers from across the country and began serving notices of eviction. So not only are they poor, working in dangerous conditions, relatively disenfranchised, but now they're getting evicted because they were striking for better wages and safer conditions. By this time, George Sherman had sold out, but his name was on the building, and his opulent and extravagant lifestyle was in stark contrast to that of the miners. See some of his miners right here on the left in one of his mines, and you can see, how'd you like to go in there every day, or worse. So again, some dynamic tension here. Sherman may possibly have not been a very popular guy among his mining workers. A little bit more about Sherman, and I promise there is a linkage here. He was the guy in Moriah. His many buildings dominated the landscape. They were either built by Sherman, owned by Sherman, or had his name on them. In the upper left is the Hotel Sherman, which Sherman purchased and remodeled in 1905. On the right top, the Sherman Collegiate Institute, owned and operated by the Sherman family for decades. Below it is the Sherman Company office and store to house his suite of offices, along with a general store and drugstore. Again, they had to buy all their stuff at these places. And over in Edgemont, of course, that's where he had his mistress. Featured 14 large rooms, elegant decorations, steam, heat, gas light, hot and cold running water, horse barns, 10 outbuildings, and fruit orchards. You can still go there today. It is a gorgeous bed and breakfast. All the grounds are preserved, as is the house. So you can see how his mistress lived. All 55 acres of land overlooked Lake Champlain. But Sherman's pride and joy was really Idlehurst. That's what he built for him to live in, right there in the bottom right corner. You can see it, built around 1907. Beautiful, beautiful home. Outbuildings like this gorgeous barn in the back. If you go through Moriah today, and I went through in August, it doesn't really look like this. You've been through some hamlets, I'm sure, in the country lately, and it's kind of falling down. But think about it, in a hamlet of maybe, I don't know, 100 people, all these buildings had his name on them, and he built them all. So very, very prominent, almost like his little empire. Now, what has that got to do with anything? Idlehurst was and is beautiful, but the front veranda looks very different today. That's what it looked like in 1908. Do you notice that front porch? Beautiful, in concert with the rest of the house. Here's a picture I took in 1908. I mean in 2024, in 1908, 2024. Do you notice anything different about the front of the house? What's holding the porch up? Stone pillars, right. There's a reason for that. So Sherman's personal residence at Idlehurst included all the same amenities as Edgemont, his mistress's home, including the same stunning views of Lake Champlain. On the left, you see it as it appeared in 1908 at the time of the case. On the right is how it looks today. Like I said, I just took that picture in August. It's well preserved, but has a very different front end. And if you look closely, you'll see that the house appears essentially the same, but the front veranda, again, does look very different. The ornate woodwork on the columns and railings was replaced years ago with heavy stonework, and there's a reason for that. So at 1 o'clock in the morning on May 12, 1908, Idlehurst was dynamited while Sherman and his family slept soundly inside. Now, guys got a lot of enemies, right? Potentially. The blast broke all the windows in front, blew the front veranda right off the house, which is why Idlehurst looks a little different today. The dynamiters left no clue except a card about 12 inches long and 6 inches wide, on which was scrawled the following message: if the dynamite does not kill you, no matter how many bodyguards you may have about you, we will shoot you if you do not leave town. So I think it's a pretty unequivocal, clear message about what people wanted him to do. He had become persona non grata in Moriah, and that's a pretty serious threat. So he took it very, very seriously. Some 6 months later, the dynamiters were caught and arrested, right? That's good. Allegedly, one Harry Allen, who'd been in charge of the Sherman stock farm, wanted to get even with Sherman after Sherman fired him for neglecting his horses. That's one theory. There may be others, including miners. This guy, Allen, the dynamiter, confessed and convinced 5 other men to help him, avenge him before he confessed, and they all dynamited Sherman's Idlehurst home. I should say 2 of the gang members confessed, turning state's evidence and implicating the other 4, including Allen. Here's the key. When the 6 gang members were indicted, they faced 10 years in prison. Thankfully, no one in Sherman's family died, but it was a serious offense. It was a very serious crime, but the whole thing strikes me as a bit strange. Let's talk about it for a second. First, not one member of the gang was ever tried, let alone convicted. Now, I guarantee you, if Bob and Fred and my brother went out and dynamited somebody's house, you'd probably show up in court at some point. So that's a little bit strange right there. Instead, they were all released on their recognizance 9 months after they were indicted. And I actually spoke with the first assistant district attorney of Essex County, who remarkably lives in Idlehurst, the home that got dynamited. He's kind of become a student of the case, and no one has better access to the records than the DA for the county. He says there's no record of the case on file in the courthouse. None. So where did the records go? They weren't indicted. I mean, they weren't tried, they weren't convicted, and there are no records from the case, which is a little bit strange. Second, this crime was planned and committed by Harry Allen, a fellow horseman and co-worker of James Lawler, the guy who disappeared in Dead Creek, just 6 weeks before Lawler disappeared in Dead Creek with a ton of money on it. I think clearly Sherman the millionaire, whose home was dynamited, Allen the dynamiter, and their compatriots all worked with Lawler. They knew him well, but no one ever interviewed them about Lawler's disappearance. Not Chief Helms from Baldwinsville, not anybody the family hired up in Glens Falls or Mariah. Nobody talked to any of these people. Now, this was before the state police was formed, and so all of these crimes, regardless of the level of the crime, had to be pursued and prosecuted by the county. There was no state police. Nobody coordinated things. And so, the counties didn't coordinate their efforts, and at some point when they hit dead ends, they just quit. And that was it. And so the case went away. So you got a guy who disappears in Dead Creek in 1908. Just a few weeks before, his boss's home was dynamited. The people that dynamited it were compatriots of this horseman, this disappearing guy, and nobody ever talked to any of them about, hey, what about this guy that disappeared in Dead Creek? Do you know him? What do you know of him? Did you have anything to do with it? Nothing. Setting all these mysteries aside for a second, I think George Sherman clearly got the message loud and clear. When somebody says, we'll shoot you if you don't leave town, you take it seriously. He submitted articles to multiple newspapers in upstate New York saying that anybody looking for choice bargains in millionaire estates will do well to consult the sale list of the Sherman property in Mariah and Port Henry. He sold his 3 primary properties, including his much-loved Idlehurst property where the DA now lives. And he sold them at a loss of over $100,000 or over $3 million in today's market. So he basically had a fire sale, got rid of all the property and said, maybe I should find another place to live. So a few months later, Sherman moved to Syracuse and married Nora Kane, a woman much younger than himself, who he met while she was working at a waitress at the state fairgrounds. The next year, someone burned down the Hotel Sherman. So even though he was putting everything up for sale and moved to Syracuse, they felt like maybe he hadn't gotten the message yet, and they started burning things down. Stranger still, in his last will and testament, George Sherman left his beloved Sherman stock farm, where he raised his horses, and raced them to a brother of one of the gang of 6 accused of dynamiting his house. So let's just be really clear. This group dynamites his house, almost kills him and his family. They're indicted but not tried or convicted. And then when Sherman writes his will, one of these 6 guys who tried to blow up his house gets his stock farm. That's a little strange. So we have the mysterious dynamiting of George Sherman's house by one of the horsemen in May of 1908, and the equally mysterious disappearance of another of the horsemen, James Lawler, with a ton of money on him just 6 weeks later. Are the 2 cases linked? Personally, I don't believe in coincidences, but the mystery doesn't end there. There's even more. So my last question is, I mentioned the case reaches all the way to New Mexico. How and why? The case is complicated a great deal by a development just a few years after this case out in the mountains of New Mexico, which at the time was not even yet a state, it was still a territory like Arizona. In February of 1911, a rancher found a half-frozen man in a snow-filled pass near Mountain Air, New Mexico, at the south end of the Manzano Mountains. Here you can see the earliest known photograph of Mountain Air in 1916. Pretty primitive, what you might expect of a dusty western town in the frontier. And there's its location on a map in New Mexico. Again, New Mexico wasn't a territory, or was a territory, wasn't a state, wouldn't become a state until 1912, and Mountain Air is a very, very desolate place even today, let alone 100 years ago. So the man was taken to Albuquerque for medical treatment. Both of his feet were frozen. It was thought he would recover, but his condition took a turn for the worse. However, and he died. He gave his name as Frank Kennedy, and when questioned by the physicians, he said that he'd been traveling around the country. Now, that may not explain why he was found in a ravine in the middle of the winter in a snow-filled pass near Albuquerque with no apparent means of survival, but that's the story he gave. He did die of frostbite and exposure at the Sisters Hospital in Albuquerque. That building is still there. It's still a hospital. You can read the article, Unmanned Victim of Cold. So I'll read it to you real quick. Giving his name as Frank Kennedy, died. He was found by a rancher in a canyon near Mountain Air. He wanted to take the stranger to his home and get medical aid, but Kennedy refused, saying he'd come there to die. He was taken to Albuquerque and died as recorded. $80 was found strapped in a belt on his person, which saved him from a pauper's burial. His friends had not been located. Now, after Kennedy died, if that was in fact his name, the undertaker found the $80 strapped in a belt on his body, but that's not all he found. Inside Kennedy's pockets, the undertaker found a deed and a letter. The deed was for a property in Glens Falls, New York. Guess who owned the property? James Lawler, the guy who disappeared in Dead Creek. The letter had been written to James Lawler from Glens Falls by his sister Mary. So how did this guy, maybe a fake name, maybe not, get the letter, get the deed from this guy that disappeared in Dead Creek, this Lawler guy? Both documents were dated before Lawler's disappearance in Dead Creek, which implies that they were taken from Lawler. The undertaker sent the deed and the letter to Lawler's father and brother in Glens Falls, along with a photograph of the dead man who claimed he was Frank Kennedy for possible identification. But the father and the brother both denied that the dead man was James Lawler. So you got this guy, maybe his name's Frank Kennedy, maybe it's not. He claims to be, doesn't claim to be James Lawler, but he's got, artifacts on him that lead back to James Lawler that predate the disappearance in Dead Creek. Checked a little further. There's I know Barb knows about this. There's a source out online called findagrave.com. Has anybody used it to look up gravestones? It's pretty well done. It's all done by volunteers. I've contributed photographs, memorials, everything. Everybody does. This is the only time I found two listings for one person. Under Find a Grave, the online memorial for James Lawler in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Albuquerque, New Mexico, says simply, "See Frank Kennedy," which is really unusual. And so you go to Frank Kennedy, and under that memorial, in the same cemetery, the notes read as follows: age 30, died at St. Joseph's, cause of death, frozen feet, carried a deed signed John and Julia Lawler, also used the last name Kennedy, had a letter from Glens Falls, New York, signed Mary, and nothing else to identify him. He died with $80 on his person. May not actually have been named James Lawler, but was buried as such or as unknown. Death certificate used the Lawler name. So you've got a really, really strange case. Again, the only one I've found on Find a Grave. We're in the same exact cemetery. You've got two listings covering the same burial. James Lawler, the guy who disappeared in Dead Creek, and his If they're not the same person, then someone, AKA Frank Kennedy, same cemetery, same grave, with a little bit more detail. Who is it? Is it James Lawler? Is it Frank Kennedy? The father and brother of Lawler, when they saw the photo, his postmortem photo, claimed that's not our son, so we have to kind of believe that. But, you know, there's also a death certificate in Glens Falls for James F. Lawler, since that's where he was from. That's where his father and brother lived, and tried to look for him. But it's dated September 29, 1914, some 6 years after his disappearance in Dead Creek. That's most likely when his family had him officially declared dead. So literally, James F. Lawler has 3 memorials on Find a Grave. There's the James Lawler, who may be buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Albuquerque, New Mexico in February 1911. Frank Kennedy, who may or may not be James Lawler, or may have stolen these materials from him or killed him, buried February 1911 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then James Lawler with a marker in Glens Falls for 1914. Only case in Find a Grave where I found 3 markers for 1 person. That's pretty much all we know about the disappearance in Dead Creek. And so I kind of, you know, most of these cases, you know, we try to solve them, right? Somebody got murdered, we kind of know who did it. Let's talk about how it happened. I don't think we really know what happened here. I think it leaves us with more questions than answered. First question I have, you know, over 100 years later, why did James Lawler visit Whiskey Hollow, and what was he doing in Dead Creek? This wasn't a very populated area. It was a hike from the state fairgrounds. He would have had to take a train, right? Probably to Warner's, closest train station, and walk, you know, or get a ride to Dead Creek or Whiskey Hollow. And what the heck was he doing there? Second, why did he have so much money on him when he disappeared? You know, $30,000 or $40,000 in today's dollars. Was he involved in the dynamiting of George Sherman's Idlehurst home? Could that be where he got part of the money, where people paid off? Was he involved? Was this Sherman guy, you know, the wealthy scion, was he involved in the disappearance just 6 weeks later? I think that's a big coincidence. Why didn't Police Chief Andrew Helm in Baldwinsville question this guy Sherman, the wealthy man, about his employee Lawler's disappearance? Why didn't anyone connect these 2 violent crimes that happened just 6 weeks apart? Lawler disappears, his artifacts are found, he's presumed murdered, and then his boss's veranda gets blown up by dynamite 6 weeks later, and nobody says, hey, was this a conspiracy? Were the same people involved? What happened? Why wasn't Harry Allen, the dynamiter, and his 5 co-conspirators of Sherman's home ever tried? Again, they were indicted. Plenty of evidence. I think I said 2 to 4 of them confessed. They had collateral damage, no record, but we know they were never prosecuted or convicted. And what was Frank Kennedy's relationship with James Lawler, this guy who allegedly was named Frank Kennedy in the mountains of New Mexico with frozen feet, but with Lawler's documents on him? What was his relationship with Lawler? Did he bump into Lawler and steal him from him? Did he knock him out, push him in the snow? Well, it wasn't snow, it was summer. Push him in the creek and just leave him there to die? Or was there a fight? Did someone get killed? There were bullets found, but there were never any spent shells, but never any body. And then why did he have Lawler's documents? How did he get a hold of them? What did he intend to do with them? And all of these things. So, like I said, I usually try to solve these things, but I've really let you down tonight. And I'm sorry for that. So we'll schedule another murder case soon and we'll solve the darn thing. But, you know, I have a couple of potential solutions. You know, I think there are 4. One, Lawler died accidentally, perhaps when he's caught in quicksand. I mean, somebody reported there's quicksand in Dead Creek and a cow got caught in it. I've never heard anything about that. I've never seen any quicksand, so who knows? Lawler committed suicide probably because he was despondent. We heard he was depressed and acting strangely, didn't collect his pay. But what was he depressed about? Did it have anything to do with his boss's house getting dynamited? We don't know. Lawler was murdered for his money or for some motive unknown. And then lastly, he left here for parts unknown and for reasons unknown. For some strange reason, left his shirt or coat and suitcase behind and some papers, took off out west, bumped into this alleged Frank Kennedy who ended up with his papers. I don't know. I guess we could turn on the lights and do a show of hands and kind of think, or say, number one, do we have time for questions? I think we're what, an hour and a half in? It's kind of late. But number two, does anybody have any ideas? What do you think happened? Fred?
Is it possible? Well, I guess anything's possible, but Lawler stole from his boss up in Mariah, which would account for all the money he had, and then went to Syracuse, and then the dynamite might have been an unrelated issue. The guy, Sherman, ends up in Syracuse. Amy Lawler spots him at the track and says, "Oh, what's this guy doing here?" And then he maybe just went west and, got overcame by guilt, and, and possibly the brother and father didn't identify him, but if he was dead and if they hadn't seen him for many years, maybe they just didn't recognize him.
So two unrelated crimes just happen to be around the same time. Lawler steals from his boss. His boss gets dynamited for different reasons, and Lawler takes off. I think that's a reasonable proposition. Others?
You said that Sherman had tracks, right?
Hmm?
Was there any gambling involved?
Oh, I'm sure.
So it could be, maybe Sherman was involved in gambling, old money, fixing races, something like that.
Could be.
So when the thing got blown up, maybe it got covered up by the people that run gambling,
Right. My understanding is they had prize money at this grand circuit, including at the state fair, but the prize money was dwarfed by the amount of gambling that was going around, illicit gambling going on around the track. So I think that's an opportunity too. There was gambling involved and lots more money. Yeah. Others? Tim?
Maybe you ought to go and dig a grave.
That's what actually I was going to suggest is I think we all need to get shovels and head for Dead Creek and get permission from the landowners. I think he's still there. I mean, they didn't know where his body was. Doesn't mean just because his jacket was found and his papers were found that his body is in close proximity. I think he's somewhere, I do believe, seriously, he's somewhere still in Dead Creek somewhere. I don't want to get shot going to look for the guy, though. So.
I don't want to sit in quicksand either,
Yeah.
But it could be another body that's in Dead Creek, somebody else, and he went to New Mexico.
Oh. So he set up his own death by putting another body there?
Yeah, or he got in a fight and killed that person and then took off to New Mexico.
Right. Possibly, sure.
Because the women smelled something, we assume it's the body, but no body was ever found. We're assuming it's Lawler's body, but it could have been a different body.
I hadn't even thought of that. I think it's a great possibility, yeah. Frank Kennedy?
Is dead.
Frank Kennedy is where now?
He would be the one dead in the creek.
He's dead in Dead Creek,
Lawler took his identity.
and Lawler took his identity. Even though the father and brother saw photos of him post-mortem and said it's not our son, but who knows? He could have changed, right? That's a possibility. Gail?
Well, I don't know, I'm looking at this, and it said that the minors he worked with said he was despondent and depressed.
Hmm?
Yet, he goes to Syracuse, and then he takes off to this remote area. And he has dinner with the family. They all report him to be this amiable guy who doesn't seem like he's despondent or anything. I think that he intended to do that and make it look like he was killed or dead somewhere. And I think he took off.
So left his coat, left his suitcase,
Yeah.
kept the money, and just booked
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
And he wouldn't need, he could buy another coat, he could buy
Right.
whatever. And I don't know if that was really him in New Mexico,
Right.
and his parents knew about, or his father knew that he was on the lam and he had stolen money or whatever, but I think he was still alive. But it's only a thought.
Do you think that someone from Glenn's Falls, I know he came to the circuit, but that he would know who's going to a desolate area? Would they know,
The family in Glens Falls?
No, Lawler himself, like when he went out to the area, would he know he was going to a place where it was a kind of a dead man's, nothing there, desolate, isolated. We know that? I mean,
I don't
we
know.
didn't know that back then?
I mean, compared to Syracuse at the time, you know, the Kingdom area, Dead Creek, Whiskey Hollow, there were, you know, Iona Corners, all of that whole area was very sparsely populated. They were very poor. They were shingle makers. They were moonshiners. They were trying to eke out a living on the land. It wasn't very arable because it was so steep and rocky. And so these were not people that were well off. So it's not the kind of place where people were going to recreate or spend the day. It was a kind of off the beaten track. So I don't know. But I like Tim's idea about going out and excavating, so bring your shovels. We have another question?
Did you ever check census records? Well, it's probably common, but census records around that time to see if there was a Frank Kennedy in Glens Falls or around there?
Oh, yeah. I'm relentless, and I spend way too much time.
Around here.
Yeah, I've checked both Lawler and Kennedy, anywhere they could have been during this time period. Census records actually got pretty good around 1900. The 1890 census was burned up and lost. But 1900 on, and it got more detailed as the years went on. So you didn't just get basic information, you got occupation, you got income, you got family members, what the family members were doing, you got street addresses, not just, you know, they were somewhere in town. So I did check all that information. I mean, I could probably check it again, but I couldn't find anything. Yeah. And New Mexico's census records were pretty lacking because it was a territory, it wasn't a state yet. Anybody else? Yes?
Just out of curiosity, if I remember, did you say at the beginning that Lawler had a letter written that notifying him that his mother had died? Could he have been despondent and why he left the job
Yes.
without?
Yeah, I didn't even make that connection, and I think Gail was saying that too, about, you know, that could have prompted a depression, losing his mom, and he was far away. He'd been traveling for some time, so he wasn't able to get back to Glens Falls. So, you know, I didn't even think about that, but that could have created, he could have had an episode, you know, and just chucked everything and took off. Yeah, that's a really good hypothesis. Others? Okay, so that's the disappearance of Dead Creek. We promise many more local history presentations. This is the last one for the season, right? But next year we start in May. We have one a month all the way through October. And how many murders are we going to do again? It's like I said last time, we'll do more, but you know, we just haven't had too many in the Phoenix area, so we'll just have to wait. So, okay, Keith, thank you. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate your time. You want to say anything?
Please have some refreshments. We never remember to tell anyone your guest was right up there.
Just another reminder, not just this one, but all of our presentations for the Schroeppel Historical Society in Phoenix and Beecham and Ballinsville are on PAC-B on YouTube if you miss them. They're really great. And Mac and the folks at PAC-B do a great job uploading these. It'll be up probably 10 days, 2 weeks. Yeah, and you'll get to watch other interesting presentations. So thank PAC-B, please.